Have you ever wondered why a stranger's kindness on your worst day changed the direction of your entire life? Or why the loss that broke you became the thing that built you? Or why the moment everything fell apart was also looking wrong, the moment everything began? Think about the last time you looked back at your life and tried to make sense of it. Not the highlights, but all of it. The decisions that seemed right and weren't. The relationships that ended before you were ready. The losses that arrived without permission and stayed without apology. The version of yourself you plan to become. And the quiet distance between that version and the one looking back right now. And beneath all of it, the question you have probably never said out loud: was any of this connected? Did any of it mean something? You say, or has my life just been a series of things that happened, and I have been trying and failing to turn them into a story that makes sense? If you have ever felt that, even once, even quietly, even at 2 a.m. when the house was still, what I am about to share with you today is for you. Here is what ancient Zen wisdom and the most rigorous corners of modern science now agree on. Nothing in your life has been random. Not the losses, not the strangers who appeared at exactly the right moment, not the failures that redirected you, not the pain that reshaped you. Everything, every single thread, has been part of a pattern so intricate that most of us never see it because we are standing too close to the fabric. Think of a hand-woven tapestry. From the back, it looks like case. Tangled threads, knotted connections, colors that clash, which in patterns but make no sense. But turn it over and you see a masterpiece. Every dark thread was necessary. Every knot was intentional. Every crossing that looked like confusion was precisely placed. Your life is that tapestry. And today, perhaps for the first time, you are going to see it from the front. Before we go any further, I want you to think of one moment that felt like pure loss. A relationship that ended. A dream that never became real. A person you lost too soon. Hold that moment, because by the time we finish today, I believe you will see it differently. Not with forced positivity, not with denial, but with the kind of understanding that only comes when you finally step back far enough to see the whole tapestry, not just the single thread you have been staring at for all these years. But before we can understand how everything is connected, we need to first dismantle something most people spend their entire lives never questioning: the belief that we are separate to begin with. Because that belief, that quiet, persistent conviction that you are fundamentally alone in this, may be the single most painful misunderstanding a human being can carry through a lifetime. That is exactly where we begin. 1. The illusion of separateness. When was the last time you felt truly alone? Not just physically alone, but alone in the way that makes you wonder whether anyone has ever really known you. Have you ever truly belonged anywhere? That feeling has a name in Buddhist teaching. And more importantly, it has a cure. We were raised to believe that we are separate, that the self ends at the boundary of the skin, that your story is yours and mine is mine. And between us, there is a clear and permanent dividing line. And when life gets hard, when the people we love disappear, when the roles that defined us fall away, when the house gets quieter than we ever imagined it would, that sense of separateness stops feeling like independence. It starts feeling like exile, like something went wrong, like we have somehow ended up on the outside of a life that was supposed to include us. But here is what the deepest teaching in Buddhist philosophy has always said, and what modern neuroscience is now beginning to confirm in genuinely astonishing ways. The boundary you feel between yourself and everything else is not as solid as it appears. It is real in the practical sense, but it is not the deepest truth about what you are. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh gave this truth a word: interbeing. He taught that if you look deeply into a single sheet of paper, You will find the cloud inside it, because without cloud there is no rain. Without rain there is no tree. Without tree there is no paper. You will find the logger, the miller, the sun, and the soil. Everything that exists is present in that one sheet of paper. Nothing exists independently. Shall nothing, including you, exists outside the vast web of connection that life itself is. And here is what science adds to this. Neuroscientist Giacomo Rizzolatti and his colleagues at the University of Parma discovered a class of brain cells, mirror neurons, that fire both when we act and when we watch someone else perform the same action. In other words, at the level of the brain, the boundary between self and other is not absolute. When you witness someone else's pain, your brain activates as though the pain were your own. When you see someone smile, your brain rehearses the smile before your face makes it. We are built, neurologically, biologically, not for isolation, but for resonance. The separation we feel is real, but it is not the whole story. But here is the layer that cuts deepest, the layer that no one talks about when they speak of loneliness after 60. The particular loneliness of this season of life is rarely about having no one nearby. It is about the loss of the roles that once made connections feel automatic. When you were raising children, connection happened through need. They needed you, and in being needed, you were anchored. When you were working, connection happened through shared purpose. When your partner was alive, connection happened through presence, through being witnessed in the dailiness of an ordinary life. And then, one by one, those structures fall away. Yes, and suddenly you are standing in a life that looks full from the outside and asking a question so quiet and so devastating that most people never say it aloud. If I am not what I do for others, if I am not the role I used to play, then how do I still belong to any of this? I once sat with a woman named Eleanor, 73 years old, 45 years of marriage, and 18 months of widowhood that had left her feeling not just bereaved but dissolved. She said something I have never forgotten. I don't know who I am when there's no one there to see me. Not because she was weak, but because she had discovered in the most brutal possible way that the self she knew had been built in relationship, woven out of being witnessed, being needed, being part of something that extended beyond her own skin. And when that something was gone, she couldn't find the edges of herself anymore. What shifted for Eleanor, slowly, imperfectly, over many months, was not grief counseling or medication or the passage of time alone. It was a single idea from Buddhist teaching that landed in her like a stone dropping into still water. The people we love do not leave us when they go. They become part of the structure of who we are. Every conversation she had ever had with her husband was still alive in how she listened. Every meal she had ever cooked for her children was still alive in how she thought about nourishment. Every act of love she had ever given was still present, not in memory, but in the actual cellular construction of who Eleanor was. She had not lost him. He had built her, and building does not disappear when the builder leaves. A student once asked his Zen master, "What happens to us after we die?" The master picked up a burning candle. "What happens to the flame when the candle goes out?" The student said, "It disappears." The master shook his head. "It continues in the warmth it left behind, in the light that reached your eyes, in the air that was touched by it. The flame does not disappear. It simply stops being separate. You are not a single thread that has lost its place. You are part of a weaving so vast and so ancient that no single thread can see its own role from where it sits. But the weaving knows. Every thread matters. Every connection, even the ones that ended, even the ones that hurt, changed the pattern in ways that nothing else could have. The old sentence is, "I am alone. My connections are gone. Yet there is nothing left that holds me." The new sentence is, "I am woven into everything I have ever loved. Separation is the illusion. Connection is the truth. Most people will spend the rest of their lives believing that the loneliness they feel is evidence that they don't belong. They will never discover that the loneliness itself, that ache, that reaching, that sense of something missing, is proof of how deeply they were built for connection, and that the connection they are searching for has never actually left. It has just been waiting for them to look in a different direction. Tonight, think of one person whose life has been touched by yours, even slightly, even briefly. A child who carries something of the way you love them. A friend who still thinks of something you said. A stranger you helped on a day you have long since forgotten. That is not the past. That is the tapestry, still being woven, still including you, even now, even here, even in the quiet. So we are not separate. We never were. But if everything is connected, then this raises the question that cuts even deeper. What about the painful connections? What about the losses, the betrayals, the chapters that felt not like part of a pattern, but like pure, purposeless destruction? If everything is woven together, then what is the meaning of the threads that only seem to cause pain? That is the question that the Buddhist teaching on suffering answers with one of its most radical and most misunderstood truths. And it changes everything about how you read the hardest chapters of your life. That is exactly where we go next. 2. Why your pain was never pointless. What if the hardest thing that ever happened to you was not a punishment? What if it was not a mistake? What if it was not even bad luck? What if it were the most precise, the most necessary, the most carefully placed thread in the entire tapestry of your life? We live in a world that treats suffering as a malfunction. If you are in pain, something has gone wrong. If you are struggling, you are losing. Get over it faster, manage it better, move through it, and come out the other side unchanged, intact, unaffected. That is what we are told. And most of us have spent a lifetime trying to do exactly that. To get through the hard things as quickly as possible, to minimize the damage, to return to something that resembles normal. And then we wonder why, decades later, the losses we never fully sat with are still aching in us. Why the grief we swallowed is still living somewhere in the body. Why the questions we never asked are still waiting, patiently and persistently, for an answer. Buddhist teaching names this clearly. It speaks of two kinds of suffering. The first is dukkha, the unavoidable. Loss, change, illness, impermanence. The simple reality that nothing in this life stays the way we need it to stay. That is the first arrow, and it hurts. But the second arrow, the one we fire at ourselves, is the story we tell about the pain. This shouldn't be happening. This isn't fair. Why me? Why this? Why now? That arrow, the Buddha taught, is always optional. And it is almost always the one that does the most lasting damage. Research from psychologists, Dr. Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, the researchers who coined the term post-traumatic growth, found something that quietly overturns everything we think we know about suffering. Across decades of study, they found that as many as 89% of people who had lived through serious trauma ultimately report at least one area of profound positive change: deeper relationships, greater personal strength, a renewed appreciation for life, or an entirely new sense of what was possible for them, not despite what they had suffered. Because of it, the suffering was not the obstacle to their growth. In many cases, it was the only path to it. Now I want to speak directly to something that I believe is carried by almost everyone who has passed 60, often in silence, which often without anyone ever asking. You have survived things, real things, losses that redrew the map of your life, disappointments that took years to absorb, chapters that were so hard you're still not entirely sure how you got through them. And somewhere in you, beneath the survival, beneath the acceptance, beneath the face you show the world, there may still be a question that has never fully been answered. What was the point of all that? Why did I have to go through it? Was any of it worth what it cost? I believe the difference between growing older with wisdom and growing older with bitterness often comes down to a single thing: whether a person can look back at their hardest chapters and find meaning in them. No explanation, not fairness, not a cosmic reason that makes the loss feel justified. Just meaning, the recognition that what they endured made something possible in them that comfort and ease could never have created. I once sat with a man named James, 76 years old, a veteran who had carried the weight of his fallen comrades for 50 years. He came to a meditation retreat believing he had come to learn how to forget. What he found instead, through the lens of Buddhist teaching on connection and impermanence, was something entirely different. He did not need to forget. He needed to understand that his survival was not a debt he owed. It was a responsibility he had been given. That every day he lived was a day his comrades could not. And that did not create an obligation to suffer. It created an invitation to live with a fullness that honored them. He left not lighter in the way forgetting brings lightness, but lighter in the way that meaning brings lightness, which is the only kind that lasts. In the most exquisite tapestries, the darkest threads are never accidents. The master weaver places them with the same intention as the brightest ones. Because without darkness, light has nothing to illuminate. Without contrast, there is no depth. Without shadow, there is no dimension. Your darkest threads were placed with the same care as your brightest ones. There are no mistakes in the design. They are the design. The obstacle, as Zen teaches, is not in the way of the path. The obstacle is the path. And the person you had to become to walk through it, that person could not have been made any other way. Now, I want to be honest with you. I am not saying that every painful thing that happened to you was secretly wonderful. Some things are just hard. Some losses are simply losses. But I am saying, and I believe this with everything I have, that nothing that has genuinely shaped you has been wasted. Not the grief, not the failure, not the years that felt like they were moving in the wrong direction, especially not those. The old sentence is, that loss broke me, that failure defined me, that pain was pointless. The new sentence is, that loss opened me, that failure taught me, that pain wove into me something that could not have arrived any other way. Most people will spend the rest of their lives wishing their hardest chapters had never been written, never discovering that those chapters contain the most important sentences of the entire story. The ones that gave everything else its meaning. Don't let that be you. Why the hardest parts of your life deserve to be understood, not just endured. Think of the hardest thing you have ever been through, not to relive it, but to ask, perhaps for the first time with genuine openness, what did it make possible in you that nothing easier could have? What did it open? What did it teach? What thread did it weave into who you are today? You don't have to answer right now, just ask. The tapestry will show you. So your pain was never pointless, and your separateness was always an illusion. But here is where the teaching of connection becomes most personal and most surprising. Because the Buddhist understanding of interconnection does not stop at the abstract level of all things being woven together. It says something far more specific and far more personal than that. It says that you, individually, must irreplaceably have already changed the world in ways you cannot see from where you are standing. That the ripples of your existence have traveled further and touched more lives than you will ever know. That is the part most people over 60 have never fully allowed themselves to believe. And it is the part that changes everything about how you see the time you still have. That is exactly where we go next. 3. The ripple you cannot see. You will never know the name of the person whose life was changed by something you said on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that you have long since forgotten. You will never know how far your kindness traveled. You will never know how many stories contain you without ever mentioning your name. But they do. There is a particular kind of quiet suffering that lives in people who have passed 60, one that is rarely spoken about and rarely acknowledged. It is not the grief of losing people, though that is real. It is not the pain of physical decline, though that is real too. It is something more subtle and in some ways more devastating than either of those things. It is the creeping, persistent, utterly false conviction that your life has not mattered enough, that you did not do enough, achieve enough, give enough. That the mark you left on the world, if you left one at all, it was too small to count. That is the story of your life, when measured against some imagined standard, came up short. If you have ever felt that, even once, even at the edge of sleep, then what comes next is for you. Buddhist teaching describes karma not as reward and punishment. That is a distortion of a much older and more precise idea. In its original meaning, karma is simply this: every action creates a consequence, and every consequence becomes the cause of something further, rippling outward through the web of existence without end. A single act of kindness can boost someone's confidence. That confidence becomes a decision. That decision becomes the shape of another life. The ripple does not stop. It does not diminish with distance. It simply moves beyond the point where the person who created it can see. And here is what modern research confirms about exactly this. Nicholas Christakis, sociologist and physician at Yale University, and his colleague James Fowler conducted a landmark study using data from nearly 5,000 people tracked over 20 years as part of the Framingham Heart Study. What they found was something quietly extraordinary. Happiness, kindness, and generosity spread through social networks to 3 degrees of separation. The friend of your friend's friend, someone you have almost certainly never met and likely never will, can be measurably affected by your emotional state. Your way of being in the world is traveling right now to people whose names you do not know. Well, and here's the layer that no one ever tells people in the later chapters of life. The layer that I believe deserves to be said out loud, clearly, without softening. You are not haunted by what you didn't do nearly as much as you think you are. What actually haunts you is the belief that what you did do wasn't enough. That is a different problem, and it has a different solution. The person you were kind to on a Wednesday, you have completely forgotten. They remember. The child you believed in when no one else did, they still carry that belief in the architecture of how they see themselves. The neighbor you checked on during the hard year, they told that story to their daughter, and their daughter carries it now into her own life, into her own kindness towards someone you will never meet. You did not just touch one life. You touched everything that life has touched since, and everything that those lives have touched. The ripple is not a metaphor. It is mathematics. I believe one of the most painful and sacred things about growing older is this. You begin to see the harvest of seeds you planted decades ago. The grandchild who laughs the way you laughed. The former student who calls to say that something you said in an unremarkable classroom on an unremarkable afternoon changed the entire direction of their life. The neighbor who mentions, casually and years later, the specific moment your kindness held them together. These are not coincidences. They are the tapestry revealing itself, thread by thread, year by year, to the person who wove it. I once knew a retired teacher named Margaret, 71 years old, 35 years in classrooms, and a deep, settled conviction that she had not made a real difference, until a 45-year-old man came to find her. He told her that something she had said to him when he was 12, a single sentence she had no memory of speaking, had completely changed how he saw himself, and that he had told that story to his son, a physician, who had let it shape how he treated his patients. One sentence, 30 years, 2 generations. A ripple Margaret didn't know she had made. still moving through the world, still touching lives she would never know about, still holding something together in ways she could not see from where she stood. That is not an unusual story. That is how it works, always, for everyone. In Buddhist philosophy, there is an image called Indra's net, an infinite lattice stretching across the universe, with a jewel at every intersection. And each jewel reflects all the others, perfectly, completely, endlessly. You are one of those jewels, and you reflect and are reflected by every other point in the network. Remove any single jewel and the entire reflection changes. No point in that net does not matter. No jewel can disappear without altering everything that remains. When a master weaver finishes a tapestry, there are always threads that disappear into the back of the work, invisible from the front, impossible to see directly. But remove them and the entire pattern collapses. You are one of those threads. The fact that you cannot see your own contribution from where you are standing does not mean it isn't holding everything together. It means the work is still in progress, and you are still in it. John, the old sentence is, my life hasn't mattered enough. I haven't done enough. I haven't left enough behind. The new sentence is, my life has already sent ripples I will never see the end of. The question is not whether I have mattered. It is whether I am finally willing to believe it. Most people will spend their final years haunted by what they didn't do, never realizing that what they did do has already traveled further than they can imagine, already changed more than they will ever know, already made them irreplaceable in a story far larger than their own. Don't spend the time you have left grieving an impact you don't believe you've had. You have had it. You are having it. Right now, in this moment, you are still part of the weaving. Think of one person whose life you have touched, even briefly, even slightly. You follow the thread from them to the people they have touched, and from those people outward again. That is your ripple. It is still moving. It has never stopped. So you are not separated. Your pain was never pointless. And your life has already changed the world in ways you will never fully see. There is only one question left, and it is the most important one of all. If everything is connected, if every thread matters, if every ripple continues, then what do you do with the time and the life you still have? How do you live from this moment forward in a way that honors the connection you have always been part of? That is where we finish. And it may be the simplest and the most radical answer of all. Let's go there together. Remember the tapestry we spoke about at the beginning? The one that looked like chaos from the back? You have just seen it from the front. You are not separate. You are woven into every life you have ever touched. Your pain was not pointless. It was the dark thread that gave your light its depth. Your ripples did not stop at the edge of your vision. They are still traveling right now through lives you will never meet. And this moment, right now, is still part of the weaving. You didn't need a different life. You needed to see the life you have lived from a different angle. You didn't need fewer hard chapters. You needed to understand what those chapters were making possible in you and in everyone whose life has been woven together with yours. You didn't need more time to matter. You have always mattered. Well, the question was never whether your thread belonged in the tapestry. It always did. The only question was whether you were willing, finally, fully, without apology, to believe it. After everything I have studied and every person I have sat with in the quiet of their deepest questions, I return to this truth every single time. The most healing thing a human being can discover is not that their suffering will end. It is that their suffering had meaning, that their life, with all its knots, its dark threads, its seemingly broken places, is part of something so vast, so deliberately woven, that nothing in it was ever accidental. You are not a mistake in the pattern. You are the pattern you always have been. Somewhere right now, a thread of your life is still moving through the world. In the memory of someone you once helped, in the habit of someone you once influenced, in the laugh of a child who carries something of you without ever knowing your name. The tapestry does not end when the weaver steps away. It continues in every thread that was ever connected to yours, forever, without exception, without end. If something in this video shifted something in you today, please like, share, and leave one comment. What is one connection in your life that, looking back, you now see differently? I read every single one, Piam, because your story, all of it, including the parts you haven't understood yet, matters here. It has always mattered. And this moment, right now, is still part of the weaving. It always will be.